Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mitchell Steinberg, and I'm the Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy. We're delighted today to have Bethany Nelson, Assistant Director of Research Security and Export Controls at Princeton University, join us online for a hybrid roundtable on research security issues. Also here with us is Michelle Warren, Science and Technology Officer in the Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Unit of the Economic and Scientific Affairs section at the Embassy, who will serve as today's moderator. Thank you also to all of our Japanese participants. We have an excellent group representing diverse sectors, including government, research, and academic institutions, as well as private companies and NPOs. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, both in person and online. Before we begin, I'll go over a few administrative items. This session will be conducted in English. The speaker is not an employee of the U.S. government, and her remarks and expertise do not necessarily represent the official policy of the U.S. government. For those joining online, main participants are asked to keep their cameras on, but remain muted unless you're speaking. Observers are kindly requested to keep both their cameras and microphones off for the duration of the program. Following the speaker's presentation, the initial discussion between the speaker we'll have the initial discussion between the speaker and the moderator, and then we'll open up the session for questions and answers. If you have any questions in person, please raise your hand, and online, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you may also submit your question via the chat box in English. Now, let me introduce the speaker. Bethany Nelson is Assistant Director of Research Security and Export Controls at Princeton University. Prior to joining Princeton, Bethany was the Export Control Manager for the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has over a decade of experience in academic export controls and research security, and has spoken and trained professionals on the subject at events worldwide. She has previously served as the Membership and Outreach Chair for the Association of University Export Control Officers, has presented at events hosted by organizations such as AUECO, the National Council of University Research Administrators, and King's College London, and is a speaker for the U.S. Department of State Speaker Program. That's this program. She has a JD from the University of Wisconsin and a BS in physics from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Bethany for her presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. Good morning. I recognize some faces and some names, and hope to meet the rest of you at some point. As I was introduced, I'm going to talk today a little bit about research security at U.S. universities. Please feel free to, queue up questions. I only have 15 minutes to go through this. You are getting the slides, or you have already gotten them. So if I don't get to a question and we don't get to it in Q&A, please feel free to reach out to me at any point via email, and I'm happy to chat and offer whatever expertise I can. And if I can't answer the question, hopefully I can get you in touch with somebody who can at another university. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so jumping right in. So I was asked to talk about a few broad topics today, and so just kind of starting with research security and risk management. If you've been to some of my other talks that I've done, you're going to see a little bit of crossover with some of these things, but it is mostly new information that I am trying to give you here. So the big thing I was asked to talk about was research security risks, and there's a lot of them across the board, and they're much the same like other academic compliance area risks. You've got a loss of funding is really a big thing. You could transfer something to a bad actor, to somebody who really shouldn't have the information and the items, etc. Fines, so there's definitely monetary risks. Jail, which is pretty extreme, but has occurred, as well as bad press, which in some ways is kind of well, not in some ways. It's definitely an issue for universities who rely on the public, who rely on good opinions. An example right off the bat, you've possibly have heard of this, is Charles Lieber at Harvard University. He did not disclose that he was doing work or getting payment from a particular Chinese university. The Chinese university was using Harvard's name on things, saying that they had this relationship. He was ultimately found guilty of making false statements and income tax fraud because the income tax, because he wasn't paying taxes on any of the money he was getting, and in fact was bringing home just bags of cash with him from China. But also because when he was asked to by the US federal government in the course of applying for funding for his research, he was asked, do you have any outside collaborations? Are you appointed at any outside universities? Do you have any of these relationships? And he said, no, he didn't. So he was ultimately found guilty of not disclosing these things that he was supposed to. He was fined. He got 2 days in prison and 2 years supervised release. A lot of bad press, a lot of issues surrounding this. And I think this was kind of the big first thing we saw about research security in the US. I've got a ton more examples here just of penalties involving universities. And really what they mostly center on is this idea of not disclosing. You have to tell the federal government, hey, I'm doing these other things. I'm not just doing this work for the university I'm at. I have these other connections, these other relationships. And that's really a big problem. I think, we also have issues with people lying. There's been some stealing of information. There's been false tax returns. But the bottom line is, and what I tell all my professors that I advise is, disclose what you're doing. Make sure that you tell when you're asked what you do, make sure that you explain everything that you're doing, all those foreign and US based connections, quite frankly, so that nobody can come and say, well, you didn't tell us that you had this relationship. And that's really a big thing that it boils down to. So in terms of a risk assessment around research security, that comes from a variety of things across campus. And, we're looking at things like the proposals that are being submitted. We're seeing a lot of research security language in those contracts. We do conflict of interest reviews, so the professors have to disclose all of their outside activities. We look at that for potential risk for research security. There's conflict of commitment issues, which is kind of a new thing in the US, which is this idea of, are you doing too much? Charles Lieber, that example from before, he, between his contract at Harvard and his contract at the Chinese university, had committed to more days in a year than there were to be able to do both those things. He committed to something like 200 days at the Chinese university and 200 days at Harvard University. That's 400 days. You can't do that. So that's another thing we look at. Travel, where are you going? Who's paying for it? What are you doing? Publications has become much more in the forefront in the US, concerns over who are you actually publishing, who are you working with, and then the collaborations, of course. How do you mitigate those threats? Well, a big thing is a research security plan or risk mitigation plan, which is just a way to say, hey, here's how we deal with these potential concerns that we have around research security. And we lay it out in a document. If you're familiar with a technology control plan or TCP, it has a lot of similarities to that. We integrate offices across campus so that you're talking to each other and potential issues can be raised in multiple different areas so that nobody is surprised or there's not a situation where one office is working on something and another office doesn't realize there's a problem. Clear policies and procedures for your school. And I stress your school because something we're going to talk about in a little bit here is there are legal requirements and we know those. Those are things that you can point to and say, this is something you cannot do. It's not legal. The thing is, there's a lot of these gray areas and different schools are going to have different approaches and different risk tolerances to that. So for example, something that Princeton might be okay with, another school might not be, and vice versa. I've had conversations with professors where they've said, well, I have a colleague at another university who's doing this. Why can't I do it? Well, Princeton has a different approach and decided that this was not something that they wanted to pursue. So that's something that only your school can make a decision on. And then in the US, especially, the different agencies of the US government have different requirements for what you need to do for research security with the different types of funding you're getting, which can get really confusing. But that means that people in my position have to be very much aware of the different things that you need to know. That somebody getting NASA funding, I need to look at that differently than somebody who's getting Department of Energy funding or NSF funding. So again, it's going to vary depending on how that happens. All of that goes into that mitigating threats idea. This is a really high-level overview of a research security plan or risk mitigation plan. And essentially, if the government has concerns regarding a project, they're going to tell us, hey, you need to put together a risk mitigation plan to address these concerns. We sometimes don't like calling it a risk mitigation plan because if a researcher hears the phrase risk mitigation, they can sometimes think, well, wait a minute, I don't have risks. What are you talking about? Research security can kind of have a slightly better ring to it. But this plan can cover a lot of different things, from foreign talent recruitment program involvement, potential limitations on travel, collaborations, affiliations and associations. And we have been asked at times to respond to specific publications. So, for example, a government agency may say, well, we saw that this professor published a paper with a person who is from a foreign country and at a particular foreign university we're concerned about. You need to explain that relationship and really getting into details like that. So, some really big overall trends in the US that I'm seeing in research security, and keeping in mind that research security is a newer thing. I remember a few years ago being in an export control conference where we started talking about what is research security, and nobody knew what it was. It wasn't it wasn't informed. So the fact that there are trends now just a few years later is kind of interesting. One of the big things in the US is this attempt to harmonize multiple government offices standards. So, as I was saying, different agencies have different requirements. That's very taxing on us and quite problematic. So, the US government is trying to make an active effort so that there's one standard that we have to follow, and that each separate office doesn't have their own standard that would be required. Currently, a couple of US agencies require collection and review of outside contracts. So if a professor has some travel or is doing some outside consulting or goes and speaks at a conference for a day or two, we need to look at that contract that they had, review it, and make sure there's nothing of concern. But it's only for specific agencies. This is a pretty big deal and kind of changed how our review system works, how we collect things, how we have to look at things. And then recently, there were several reports from the US Congress regarding research security concerns. I've included a link there, and they're all centered around how academia is approaching things. The reports have a tendency to point to perceived issues. So, not that there aren't valid concerns in there, but I will say there's a lot of times where the report even states there's nothing illegal about what this person did. We are just concerned about it. And so we're seeing that more and more is being called out for things that are not illegal, and are possibly, not even reaching a standard that we would ever consider of concern, but that the US government is looking at and is perceiving as a potential issue, is thinking that it's a potential issue, even if it's not. So, for challenges in international collaborations, I see two competing extremes here. We've got researchers who hesitate to engage in certain activities. I've got researchers who say, I'm worried about working with foreign collaborators. I'm worried about accepting speaking engagements. I'm worried about hosting persons on campus. And going to that extreme past, they're going past what is required. They're going past our recommendations. And then on the other hand, we also have researchers who are kind of ignoring our recommendations. They're not doing illegal activities, but they're starting to engage in, or they want to do things that we would consider to be higher risk and possibly not it's something that we would advise. And so it's very difficult if something does not have a legal restriction, but would be what we call a red flag, would make us go, this doesn't look right, or I have a concern about this, or if people see this, they may think this is a problem. So there's usually a gap between what is illegal, and when you see something that's illegal, you can say, no, you can't do that, that's illegal, end of story. But why I am employed, why I'm sure most of you are employed, is there are lots of things that are risky but not illegal, or things that might be concerning but not illegal, and that's so much more complicated to determine. Another kind of interesting trend is journals who are refusing to publish articles because a co-author is affiliated with a particular institution. So we know researchers, you can sometimes have hundreds of co-authors on papers, and your professor from your school has had no interaction with this person, but because they are affiliated, because they work at a particular institution that the journal is concerned about, they'll say, no, you cannot publish. Again, just a newer trend that is concerning. In terms of capacity building, you've got to build something into your process. To do research security, you have to build something into your existing processes. But to do that, you need to identify what is high risk, the office that's going to handle this, and you need to reasonably determine what can and can't they do. If there's one person handling compliance and then you put research security on top of everything else they're doing, that may just not be feasible. So something I recommend in any compliance area, I've recommended this in export controls for many years, is to start tracking numbers of reviews. How many people are coming to you and asking about this? How many contracts are you looking at? How much time are you spending on this? How much time are you coming to trainings like this, reading over government documents, things like that? Make sure to keep track of those and showcase them to people, because I know in my case, there was from management, they didn't realize how much time goes into this. They didn't understand the amount of time. And so you need to be able to present that and say, hey, we need more people, we need more time, we need more allocation for this. At this point in the US, a lot of schools have hired and expanded our offices to handle research security specifically. A lot of times within the export control office, the person takes it on, but you get more people in there. And so again, that came about because everybody had to showcase this is taking a lot of time. This is just to kind of show that the Research Security Office sits in the middle of a bunch of different areas, and the things that you need are a documented program to review everything, because you want to protect your institution, but you've got to balance academic freedom, and enabling research. And that's a hard balance to find. So one thing we do is we lean on partner offices a great deal. We've got a lot of partners across campus. Well, we are the main contact. They help us, they answer our questions, they give us particular issues as they arise. So I very much encourage everybody to form those connections that you probably already have across your campus, but to make a research security group that you can be at the center of, or whoever is in charge of research security can be at the center of, but they know they have these partners and allies to help them. A few very quick case studies when I'm seeing the time count down. So a professor is traveling, and by the way, these case studies are all based on things that have happened, so they are built in reality. A professor is traveling to the Philippines for a conference. He's going to use NASA funding for the trip, but he wants to go to China to do some sightseeing at the end of the conference. And he sees that there's this cost comparison that it's cheaper to fly to China and then get a flight to the Philippines than it would be just to fly to the Philippines. So he wants to just get the flight to China. So the problem with that is that NASA funding specifically has strict requirements on no bilateral collaborations with China. And so there's a concern that if he uses NASA funds on buying a ticket to China, even though he's planning to go to a conference in the Philippines, that's going to cause potentially some issues, even though there's nothing actually occurring. And the recommendation is, well, you probably shouldn't buy the ticket to China using the NASA funds. You should buy the ticket to the Philippines. And if you want to go to China, you're going to have to do that on your own separately. Another case study that's coming up more often, a professor's publishing a paper with a former student. Student worked at the university for several years, but left a position overseas. The project was complete when the student left, but publication hasn't happened until now. Now this student is actually an assistant professor at a university that's on a restricted party list. And so the paper is going to show a publication with an entity on the restricted party list. And how do you deal with that? Well, you got to disclose it. We put it on. Professors have to tell the federal government who they're working with, and we've had to explain this. We've had the questions come up where we have to explain quite a bit, actually, that the person was at Princeton University, they were working there, they no longer are, but the work was all done. There's a misunderstanding on behalf of the federal government for how long it takes to get a paper from the beginning to publication stage. I'm realizing I'm at time, so you've got the other two case studies in your packet, and I'm happy to answer questions about that, but I will stop now.
Okay, thank you, Bethany, for your presentation. In a second, I'm going to pass it over to Michelle for the discussion and the Q&A session. Just a reminder that during the Q&A, in-person participants should raise their hand to ask a question, and online participants can use the raise hand function on Zoom or submit questions via the chat box. In the interest of time, we're not going to go around and do individual introductions, but before asking a question, feel free to say your name and your organization, and then in-person participants after the session will have a chance to network chat. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thanks so much, Mitchell. And I want to first just say thank you to Bethany for walking us through very efficiently how the U.S. universities are trying to operationalize research security. And also, I think underscoring this is still relatively new, even in the U.S. context. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we look to strengthen our bilateral cooperation in this area, which from my perspective, our shared objective is clear. We must protect research security while preserving academic freedom and enabling strong international collaboration. This is fundamentally about risk management. I think you heard that in Bethany's presentation, not about restricting legitimate science and just making informed decisions. So first, area of Bethany's presentation that I want to sort of try to summarize. A few things that stood out to me and from the U.S. experience is that many risks stem from non-disclosure, whether that be foreign funding, outside affiliations, or participation in foreign talent recruitment programs. And we saw some very high-profile cases that Bethany highlighted, including institutions like Harvard, Ohio State. I saw the Cleveland Clinic Foundation example, and all of those resulted in pretty significant reputational and financial consequences, even when the core issue was compliance and transparency. And it's also clear from Bethany's presentation that U.S. government agencies like National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health are trying to harmonize disclosure requirements. I don't think they've quite gotten there yet, but there's definitely a lot of acknowledgement of the importance of that, I think, to take some of the burden off the institutions themselves and researchers. And so that's something that we're tracking closely here at the U.S. Embassy. And so I would, I guess, pose the first question to Bethany. How can research institutions best distinguish between clearly prohibited activity, so illegal activity, and these kind of red flags, as you call them, or gray zone risks that require institutional judgment?
So thank you. That's a great question. And I think I think illegal activity is usually, I don't want to say easy, but it is a lot easier to look at something and say that's illegal. That's not something that should occur. That's not something that can happen. Um, if in the United States we have a lot of sanctions on, for example, North Korea. And so if somebody comes to me and says, well, I want to do work with North Korea, it's really easy to say, well, you can't. That's just not something you can do. Um, but then you look at something, for example, like Cuba. The United States also has extensive sanctions on Cuba, but it's much more complex. And you can do certain activities, but cannot do other activities. And trying to figure out those details is honestly what keeps me employed. So pointing out illegal things is usually fairly straightforward. That gray area where you see those red flags and you start to wonder, is this a problem? Should we do this? That becomes much more complex. And honestly, the approach for me depends on the professor, how I think they're feeling about something. I know some professors who they don't want any bother. If you give them a hint of, well, there might be these potential issues, they're done. They're walking away from it. They've got plenty of other things to do. They don't want to involve themselves. But then, for example, you can contrast that with a current issue I'm dealing with that I can't get into details about, but it involves a graduate student who's just starting their career, has this opportunity. I see a lot of red flags in it, but they really want to do it. And they're asking me, well, so is this illegal? Are you telling me I legally cannot do it? Well, no, but I don't think it's a good idea for you to do it. So I don't have a good answer for you on that, and I'm sorry. I think that's something that we struggle through, and I think it's influenced by what does your university do? What do they back you up on and not back you up on? We sometimes go through points where we will propose something. We'll say, okay, when we see a particular scenario, when we see universities from a certain country that have a military connection, here's what we want to do. Here's what we want to recommend against entering into collaborations with them for a multitude of reasons. We'll propose that up to our higher ups and say, this is the position we want to take, yes or no. And then they have to make that decision about, okay, yes, here's the policy, here's what we want to do versus no. If they come and they say, no, we're not going to take that position, well, that becomes more nuanced then, and I need to explain more and go through those red flags more. But at least then there's been a policy that has been put to me about, okay, here's what the university is going to decide to do. But that just comes over time, and it comes from things happening. And, I've seen schools who have one position and then they come into the news and all of a sudden everything shifts and their entire risk idea changes about how they approach things, how they deal with red flags. So I think it's an evolving thing that unfortunately doesn't have a good answer and is only going to get more complex as time goes on.
Thank you. Yeah, it definitely is a gray area for sure. And I think that's certainly something that Japan is grappling with as well. How do we assess some of these not illegal, but strategically risky collaborations or proposals or other related issues. And I noted you laid out this sort of two extremes of researchers either, as you said, I think ignoring some of the risk mitigation advice and then maybe some being too cautious and not and just disengaging because they see that as safer. And like you said, there's also a lot of other things that they're doing perhaps with their time. I'm curious if U.S. universities have made any attempts to have shared definitions, or if there really are differing views depending on each institution in terms of what constitutes a high-risk entity or country, and how you've maybe also approached cooperating with the federal government entities that are looking at this from the higher level policy perspective?
Yeah, so I think in terms of shared definitions, the federal government has provided us with a baseline for that. So there are comprehensively sanctioned countries, there are embargoed countries, there are sanctioned countries. And that group of countries, I think a lot of universities across the US, I can't 100% say for certain everyone, but I think most universities go, okay, these are the higher risk countries. These are the ones that we're more concerned about. Same thing with restricted parties. You know, the US government has several lists of restricted parties. And so we can all kind of agree, okay, you know, if you're on this list, which does contain everything from terrorists to drug lords to foreign universities who have military ties. Japan has its own list, which is often in parallel, right? I think we all agree, okay, those are concerning. I think in terms of the universities, every university is going to have its own decision points, and that's going to depend on a lot of things. For example, Princeton does not accept classified research. So we don't have facilities that would allow us to handle really secure, secretive, I look at it as like the James Bond, like very, very high level stuff. We don't have those facilities. We don't have that capacity. So we're going to be more risk averse to certain things. As opposed to a university that maybe does accept that high level of secure research, has a secure facility, they may say, okay, we're willing to take on more risk. Same thing, Princeton it's called an R1 institution in the US. So we get a high level of federal government research. We have very high level professors. We have good funding, all of these wonderful things. There are lots of other schools that don't have access to those, that may look at something that at Princeton we would say, we don't want to do this. This doesn't look okay to us. That another school may look at and go, well, we don't get a lot of funding. We don't get a lot of opportunities. This isn't illegal. It's a risk, but a school like that, and I'm not trying to say anything bad about this by any means. They may be pressured and say, okay, well, we have to accept more options for funding because we don't get as many choices. So I think it really differs. And I've certainly our professional conference, we've had cases where a question will be asked and you'll have two people who have a ton of experience in this area have two entirely different answers to that question because they've looked at it in different ways. Their school is set up differently. Their researchers, have different priorities, things like that. So I think there's some baseline of things that we agree on, and then some things that are just going to be open to interpretation. I do appreciate that the U.S. federal government has really tried to engage with the university community on research security, and trying to, sending people to our conferences, trying to have webinars, trying to engage with us and make sure that we understand what's going on, because that's really helpful. Because we've had those discussions where they'll say, the government may say, okay, well, we want you to do X. And we'll go, why? And they'll explain and we'll go, okay, asking us to do X isn't going to get you the result you want. That's not going to get you to where you need to be. And having those discussions and engagement is very much appreciated.
Do you have a concrete example of a recent interaction you've had with someone from the U.S. government, whether that's NSF or another entity that has really been impactful in your day-to-day work?
Well, I can tell you that at the AU ECHO conference, the Export Control Officers Conference 2 or 3 years ago, I forget when, I think it was the NSF, they came and they did a half-day session where they asked, what is research security? What does it mean to you? What would the impacts of various, they had some different scenarios and asked, what are the impacts of these scenarios if we had to go through that? And that was at a time where we didn't know what research security was. I remember sitting in there going, I'm not even sure how to answer these questions. I'm not, but it was a huge engagement with us. There's something right now called the NSF Secure Center, which was set up by or in conjunction with the US government, and that's different universities in the US trying to build tools for universities. So it's really a conduit between the US government and universities trying to put together things that are useful. Hopefully those give you some idea.
Yes, thank you. I think that's particularly helpful for Japanese participants. Oh, so I'll stop there with my questions. I could go on and on, but I want to make sure we have time to answer questions from the participants, both in person and online. I'll first open it up to the in-person group. No pressure, but if anyone has a burning question they'd like to ask, please raise your hand. And introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Itakashi Moka, the director of the department. Promotion. So I realized that you mentioned that the federal government published some kind of definition. You mentioned is that some kind of document like the FAQ? Because if we can share such kind of success story with several universities, it's important to think about how they manage the research security. But I didn't see such kind of document from your country. If you have such kind of FAQ document or some kind of document, quite difficult to think about it for us.
Sorry, and I couldn't fully hear. I think what you asked was has the US government published any sort of FAQs about research security? Is that kind of what it boils down to?
Yeah, I think he is
sorry, go
asking
ahead.
if the existing documents that the US government has provided, or maybe some kind of written FAQ general guidance from the US government for universities, generally relating to research security?
Because I think you established the secure center, but I don't know how you are managing this to answer some of the questions from the universities. But if you use the case by case management, it's very tiresome and spend a lot of time to answer for the question.
I think generally also a question about, is there a direct communication mechanism between you, if you had a question and you wanted to ask someone at NSF or another government?
Yeah, that's right. If you don't have such kind of document, there are many calls from many universities. So, but if you have such kind of definition, it's very easy to know something.
Yeah, we're a bit lacking. I just put something in chat. I'm putting some links in chat right now. Whether they are useful or not is a whole other question. We don't have a direct conduit to ask. There isn't somebody I can call and say, hey, we've got this question. What oftentimes happens is we'll have a particular agency that will say, we need more information, we need to talk to you, and then we have to deal with that agency specifically, as opposed to having a point of contact. And that's something that we as the universities have talked about, that we wish there was an easier way to have this connection. One of the links I just shared, and I'm certainly happy to send these out and make sure that that Michelle gets them and can get them to everybody, is the different agencies and the different requirements they have for things. And this isn't something that the US government came up with. This is something the Secure Center came up with, because we're all sitting here going, how do you figure this out? So I think I will say I do think that is a gap in what's happening here. And I'm hoping that with the push toward harmonization, we may get more specific FAQs and direction like we've seen in the export control side of things. But right now I don't have anything specific.
If I may add to that, again, I think this gets back at your point worth emphasizing that this is very new, even in the US. But I do think the Secure Center, one of their founding priorities is to do this kind of dissemination of information and resources, and ensure that hopefully moving forward, there is more of a coordinated approach to things like FAQs, and yeah, just really maximizing the limited resources to help share the knowledge across the university ecosystem. But I think it's very much a work in progress.
Yeah. But I think this information is very important. I think you see that the case study, one or two. So in this, some researcher want to probably to research research at the Beijing University and the who is research into the human. Maybe this is very quite great. It's very easy to understand. But I think such kind of paper document. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will now. Do you have any questions come to I have a question that we received ahead of time. I'll go to that now from Mr. Taishi Kawashima from Tokai National Higher Education and Research System. He asked, he would like to ask about briefings and training sessions related to research security, specifically at Princeton University. Three-part question. The first part, were these sessions conducted uniformly for all staff and researchers, or were they rolled out gradually, starting in specific departments? Second, how often and what was the format of training sessions established? And then third, before launching these briefings, which departments did you coordinate with, and to what extent, and how was consensus reached? He closed his question by noting that understanding the quote process of getting the program up and running would be extremely valuable as a reference for similar efforts in Japan.
Great. Yeah, again, a great series of questions. So unfortunately, I may not have the answer you want to hear on this one, because the way that research security training evolved was the National Science Foundation developed training that all covered individuals have to take. And covered individuals can vary, but it's usually whoever the professor and the researcher on the project, sort of the main people working on the project, are required to take this training. And they can log in and do a module that's about 6 minutes, about 1 hour long. And they have to do that. Each agency differs, but it's usually about once a year they have to take this training. So we did not have to develop a training about those areas of research security for the professors and the workers who are required to do this. The NSF handled that for us. It took a long time to get to where it is, but essentially they just put it in place. There was one day where the federal government said, okay, everybody needs to have their research security training done. And part of when we submit proposals or receive money is to verify that the right people have taken this training. Now, that's different from training staff and giving sort of general background about research security. And that's been done in general across campus, trying to integrate it into visits we might already make, into department meetings, trying to give people this overview of here's why you're taking this training, here's why you're going to be told you have to do this hour-long training, and making sure that the administrative staff who support those professors understand why this has to be done and why people are getting notifications on this. That all came from this federally mandated requirement that says if you want money from us, you have to have this training. And that's just the bottom line. And so that's what we tell professors, because most people take this training and they don't have a problem with it. There's a lot of trainings they have to take for a variety of reasons. They're a little annoyed, but they're okay with it. But we have had people who push back and say, well, I'm not going to take the training. And we tell them, well, then you're not going to get your money. The federal government is not going to give you money unless you do this. So that's a pretty big incentive to get people to do this. And we don't get much annoyance, especially once they do it, they get it over with. Okay, now they can move on. So that consensus didn't come from me, which made that aspect of things a lot easier in many ways, because it wasn't me telling people you had to do this. It was me saying, well, the federal government's implemented this. If you don't do it, you're not getting your funding.
Great. And if I could ask, just in terms of which departments you coordinated with, I think you hit on this with that one slide where you showed all of the various different offices that relate to research security, but maybe just to.
Yeah, so in terms of specific departments, I think we're looking more in the STEM area. So physics, engineering, any biological sciences, geology, things of that nature. Now, in theory, anyone from any department could be subject to this depending on the type of funding they get. If they're getting funding from, say, the Department of Defense, and we do, for example, have like languages. Some of the foreign languages will get money from Department of Defense for a variety of reasons. The Department of Defense wants to encourage language acquisition. They have to take the training as well, right? So there can be a wide range of people across campus who are ending up taking this training, but it really is focused on that science, math, engineering area more than anything.
Great, thank you very much. I'm looking to see if we've had any questions. Don't be shy from our online participants, but sure, we'll go to.
Thank you. My name is. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Izumi Suzuki. I'm a research fellow of Deloitte, Japan, and I'm also the visiting research fellow of Japan 500 Agency. And I see you again. I heard your presentation in Fukuoka too.
Ah, wonderful.
I see you again. I'm quite interested in the risk mitigation plans in your universities. I think Japanese universities kind of struggle with how mitigate the risk and how much level should we get the perfect, not gonna be a perfect, but we should make them like, yeah. So you mentioned about the risk assessment contents like proposal, contract, and conflict of interest, and travel and publications, also collaborations. So will you put that kind of aspect, put it in the mitigation plan, or what is the content of the mitigation plan, and how many review? I don't know how many review of the risk mitigation plan per year or per, I don't know, term of the plans, or yeah.
Yeah, great question. So we actually have here, I was talking to a colleague earlier today about how I think we have a naming problem with all this stuff because there's so many things with similar, the same names, but we mean different things when we say them. So for the university as a whole, we have a research security plan, and that is a very high level, explains what does the research security office do, what are the areas we're looking at. We're looking at those areas of conflict of interest, contracts, all of those different things. It's a very, very high level document that, to be honest with you, when you say Japanese universities are struggling with it, we're struggling with it too. We are constantly revising it. We're trying to figure out the best approach for it. We want to make sure that it's relevant to campus, but not overly restrictive. We then have this thing called either a risk mitigation plan or a research security plan. Again, I think we have a naming problem. We need to figure out different names for these things that would be to a specific project or professor. So, and that would be a case where the US federal government or internally, we would look at what that person's doing, and it's rare internally, but it does happen. But it's usually the US federal government who will come to us and say, we have concerns. We need a research security plan from you. Usually, but not always, the government will give us some idea of why they are concerned. sometimes we'll get a very specific letter from them saying, we need to know about X, Y, and Z. We want to know every time this person travels out of the country. We want to know every collaborator they've had in the past 10 years. We want to know every dollar, where it's going, where it's coming from, all of these things. And sometimes we'll get a very general letter saying, we have some concerns, we'd like you to address those. And we have a template for a risk mitigation plan that we'll look at and try to fit to the circumstances. That is also a work in progress. So I've been working on revising our risk mitigation plan template for a long time because it is so complex. In terms of the frequency of that, I should have looked up those numbers. We have, how many active risk mitigation plans do we have? Maybe 8, maybe 9, possibly less. And those would be for specific professors for specific circumstances. We will also do internal plans for professors who might have collaborations that would be considered risky. Those might not be research security risks, though. Those may be because somebody is concerned about, oh, they've hired their wife to work with them and this outside company, and that gets really complicated. So those plans can be much broader in terms of what they cover, but we do have some internal university plans as well. I will say all of our research security plan requests, it's been like the past 6 months, the majority of them have come in. We're getting more and more all the time. I had a contract today where they said, if you get this, you're going to have to give us a research security plan, so you might as well start working on it right now. So it's becoming more frequent. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, please tell me and I'll try my best.
To clear my understanding, so research security plans and also risk mitigation plan is a little bit different. And I just thought the funding agency asked to the university to submit the risk mitigation plans when they get the grant. Is that correct now?
No, not necessarily. And again, this goes, different agencies will ask you different things across a number of areas. So some agencies will say, do you have a plan? Do you have a plan for the university? But some agencies may not ask that question at all. Some agencies may say, do you have a compliance plan for their university? And they mean a bunch of different things. They mean everything from that research security and export control to, how are you properly handling biologicals? Are you properly shipping things? Are you protecting student data? Are you protecting health data? So it varies by agency and even by project. We have agencies where we have risk mitigation plans with them for some projects, but not for others. And we have cases where we have a risk mitigation plan and then they say, I don't think we need it for this aspect of things, or we don't have a plan, but we've now had more cases where we haven't had a plan. We've had a renewal of a grant, and they'll come in and say, we need a risk mitigation plan now. We want you to produce one. So it's not necessarily that you have to submit it. It is dependent upon the agency and the contracting officer you're working with.
Okay, so the kind of mitigation plan or business security plan, who is going to be create the plan, like researchers or your administrative officers, and which parts?
I'm going to write it. Research security is going to write it. We're going to talk to the professor and make sure that what we're saying is correct and that what we're proposing that the professor might do for that mitigation is actually going to be possible. And that could involve multiple offices. I have a counterpart who specifically does data security. And so I work with him a great deal on the computer security aspect of things that we might have to implement. But I cannot think of a single university that I know of, again, that doesn't mean they don't exist, that would have a professor write that plan. That sits in whatever compliance office research security is handling, because they don't have the time or the know-how
I think so.
to do it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, I'll look at the other question now that we received ahead of time. This one is from Professor, oh, would you, sure,
Okay.
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 First we'll go here to,
Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and maybe good afternoon. Thank you very much for your two presentations. Let me ask you a very simple question about your slide, titled "Challenges in International Research Collaboration." I'm afraid I was not able to understand the last sentence. Journals that will not publish articles because the co-author is affiliated with the particular institutions. Because I understand journals should have its own right to publish or not. So could you clarify this emphasis again, please?
Yes, so I think you're referring to the slide that it starts off with talking about two competing extremes and then goes through different bullet points, correct? I wanted to make sure. So we are seeing, this isn't widespread, but a scientific journal professor has submitted a paper for peer review and publication, and the journal comes back and says, we will not publish this because one of the authors of the paper is employed by an institution, by a university that is a restricted party under the US government standards. So papers that will have, 10 different authors, and one of them has this connection to a restricted university, and the journal has said, our policy is we will not publish that paper. You need to submit it somewhere else.
So thank you. So the journals have its own policy. So whether to publish or not, if there are authors affiliated with and listed entities.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite hear that.
So
I can paraphrase for you. So I think he's just trying to verify, I think what you said, that there are journals now that have their own policies regarding research security in terms of affiliations. And there seems to be maybe a trend that they are now also looking at this carefully.
Yes, this is not a law. It's not the US government saying it. It is a journal, a scientific journal that has decided themselves that their policy is that they will not publish papers that include persons from certain institutions.
Okay, thank you. Actually, we have the similar cases in our institute. So of course, we can ask researchers to stop the co-author if the co-author is researchers in North Korea, because we should not breach the national sanction. But however, so if the co-author is affiliated with entities listed in the BIS entity list or our Japan's end user list. In that case, we can't delete the contribution to the paper of the researcher. So we will publication of the paper. So we can't avoid that after the paper is ready to the public. So, but sorry, this is just a comment. So I was so surprised to hear that.
That's interesting to me that you have the same potential issues, because you may know that if a university, if any institution is on the United States entity list, the specially designated nationals list, any of those lists, you can still participate in fundamental research with that institution. You can still do research and publish a paper. That's a big red flag. That's that gray area we talked about earlier, but there's no legal stoppage on that. But I think some journals, this is my opinion. This is purely my opinion. I want to be very clear on that. I think some journals have seen what the US government, the concerns and the trends, and have probably, I think, to make it easier on themselves, they might have just decided we just don't want to deal with that. And because they're private entities, they can do that. They don't have to. But it is interesting that you're finding the same concerns. And this is very new for me. And I'm curious to see if this continues or if this is going to kind of calm and and stop. And I don't know, because it has a lot of implications. If journals start doing this has the potential to really change how collaborations and scientific publication works, on a really large level. And you can probably tell I'm confused by the whole thing, and I don't know where it's going. So I don't want to say I'm glad you're having the same issue, but this is a worldwide problem, apparently. This isn't just the US, this is other countries as well, and that's very interesting to me.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm gonna now read a question from Hokkaido University Professor Akihiko Kobayashi. And he starts with a bit of context and research security. One aspect, as we all know well, is export control for national security. Traditionally, each country has established its own regulations based on agreements within international regimes. However, recently, he mentions, regulations based on like-minded country agreements have begun to emerge, and this trend seems to be accelerating. A typical example is with quantum computing. And now to his question, in export control for national security, there's an important concept called the level playing field, but attention arises between fairness and effectiveness. So how can university export control officers best explain this point to researchers in a way that is both clear and convincing?
You tell me.
Question to wrap up.
Yeah, that's a rough one, because I feel like this, again, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've lost count for how long I've been doing this, and that was almost from day one, having people say, well, why does the US have these controls and other countries don't? There's, for example, the European Union has certain laws and regulations the US does not have, and that has some tension when we deal with those things, and that's every country, right? And in theory, this idea of harmonization of export controls around the world was supposed to kind of all bring us onto the same page. And it did in some ways, but it didn't in other ways. And, you look at the US export controls list versus the Japanese export controls list. Japanese export controls list is much more straightforward and easy to read, and really easy to look at and go, yep, this thing is controlled, or no, this thing isn't. And then I, have my researcher who's looking at the US list going, well, this isn't fair. Like, why are you telling me that this, your laptop's controlled, my cell phone's controlled? That's not fair. Why is this the case? And now multiply that across different things across the world. And we know that there are some countries who look at it very differently. And, China implemented their own export control regulation, which we're still trying to sort out. And it is still a complicated situation about how we have to respond to that. Even things, for example, we tell people you have to have things you've got to encrypt your computer when you travel. Well, certain countries say you cannot bring an encrypted device into our country, right? So all these different tensions that you're dealing with. So trying to explain to a professor, how do we have this evenness of playing field? I don't know that you can, because I remember going back to my first year on the job, talking to a professor about a a new rule that was being implemented by the federal government for export control. And he said, I am not going to get students who want to come here. The students are going to go to the UK. They're going to go to Germany. They're going to go to Japan. They're going to go to places that don't have this restriction. I'm not going to get them here. And I've heard that every year since, right? And with every new aspect and new law that gets implemented, that's something that we talk about is, we're going to lose research, we're going to lose collaborations, we're going to lose students. The only thing that I can kind of approach on is that because there are a fair amount of countries that have a like-minded approach to this, the hope is that the pool stays there, and that on my end, I try to work with the federal government and other universities try to work with the federal government to explain how important that academic exchange is and how science, it really is a cross-border situation, and there might be bad actors involved. I don't think anybody doesn't think that. But if you're going to try to put a lot of restrictions on that, it's going to cause a decrease in the scientific output you're getting and sort of the level of information you're producing. And so I try to reassure researchers that I do understand that, and that, I am on that side, and we do engage with the federal government on those issues. And, unfortunately, though, I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not the person that signs the regulations or puts those into place. So, it's my job to try to make sure that we're implemented them. But I'm there to listen to them. Sometimes it's honestly, they just want somebody to feel frustrated at and to explain their frustration, and to do my best to try to figure out ideas. Are there any alternatives we can come up with? Or is there anything else we can think of? Who else can we engage with? How can we look at this in a different way? Can I get somebody here for you and get a license for them to work on this? Can we, are you okay with a risk mitigation plan that might limit certain things? Just trying to throw out all these different ideas. Fairness is, I think we have all realized that from, when we were 2 or 3 years old. Fairness is a complicated concept as to what it means and how you achieve it. And I've yet to find a comfortable way to explain to somebody who says, well, my colleague at another university gets to do this, why can't I? Well, there's a lot of reasons. So, unfortunately, again, I'm going to go back to my original point, which is when you figure this out, tell me, because I'm going to use it. Because I don't know that there's a great answer for this. And I'm sorry for that particular answer of mine.
Thank you so much. And what I'm hearing, I think, too, broadly, is this area really requires creative thinking, problem solving, and just really good communication. I think we're almost at time, but I did want to just quickly try to paraphrase a question and a comment that came into the chat from Takao Onoye-san from Osaka University. And he talks about, how complex the regulation and rules of government are in this area, which I think have heard throughout the discussion today. And highlighted that information and knowledge sharing is very important. And his question was related to any inter-university networks available in the US to share trends and case studies about research risk management. And I think that gets back to the Secure Center, which is still young and new, but I don't know if you had any other thoughts, Bethany, on that.
Yeah, so I thank you for that. I've read your comment here in chat, and thank you for that. So the Association of University Export Control Officers, AUECO, more than 60% of AUECO's members also do research security. So we often exchange messages through our message board, and that's a really big connection point that honestly, we take advantage of. I will also say, Princeton and a couple of other schools physically close to us in the same area of the United States have just an email chain that if we have a question, you can send it to just a few people and ask the question. To your point about the protection of personal information, that is a really good point. And I will tell you, a big part of AU Echo is you cannot share anything that's been shared on the listserv. Or I should say you can share versions of it. You know, for example, somebody may say, oh, hey, does anybody have a case study about X? I'm trying to put together something, and somebody may respond to you, and then you can go to your higher ups and say, well, I talked to a colleague at another university, and they said this. But we're last year to figure out a bunch of different things, salary information, you know, number of licenses people had, TCPs people have, a ton of different information, and that's all internal. Like we made a big deal that this is information, this is sensitive information. It's information that is very useful and very valuable, but people don't want to share it unless we all agree that it's going to stay within this group. So I think that's a really big part of things, is that we do not we're very, I think we're very protective of each other in that, and we don't we don't want to go randomly talking to people about this stuff, because we understand every university has their own concerns, and because we have a group of experts, we want to keep that as a way where people can freely share information, say what they think, say what they know, say what they need, and not feel like, oh, I can't, if I say this, oh, I might get in trouble or something like that. So I highly recommend that as a rule amongst a professional group, to limit those concerns.
Okay, thank you so much for all your insightful and candid, honest reflections. I'll turn it back over to Mitchell to wrap up.
Yes, I'd like to echo Michelle. Thank you so much, Bethany. I'd also like to thank you, Michelle, and all of our participants here today in person and online. We hope that you got some valuable insights from this program, and that you'll continue to engage and to collaborate beyond today and outside of this. Before we close the program, I'd like to invite everyone to participate in a survey to share your comments and feedback about the program. Please use the QR code that will be shared on the screen. And for online participants, you can also access the survey via a link in the chat box. So once again, thank you all so much for joining us today. Appreciate your responses in the survey, and do take care.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
How much time for?
Yeah, and so for those of you here in person today, we have prepared some light refreshments. So please feel free to stay and enjoy them. Have some time to continue the conversation and network. We have about 35 minutes to.